Earlier this morning, while I was drinking my coffee and reading my Bible, it was one of those moments when a scripture that I've read hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times, suddenly I saw something in that text I had never seen before. And what I saw was what I think is perhaps the core of Christian leadership. It's one of the main issues God works on a leader's life, not just to get them in a leadership position, but I think for all of life. I think from the moment we start walking with God, probably even before that, until the end of our ministry and the end of our lives, something God is always shaping and forming and working on. So look at the scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you in these 40 years in the wilderness. Now, you know, in the beginning of Deuteronomy, it says it's 11 days journey, and then it says 40 years later. They took 40 years to go what could have been done in 11 days. Why? It's because of this issue God's working on right here. And what he says is, remember, the whole way the Lord your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that, here it is, that he might humble you. Humility is that important. God was not going to let them into the promised land until there was a corporate, a community, certainly individuals, a humility worked in the heart. So he says that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart. So you see, this humility that God's working in is a heart issue. It's always a heart issue. What God does to shape and form and get leaders ready for what he wants to do in and for and through them, it has to do with shaping the heart, and the primary thing going on in the heart is God doing stuff, orchestrating events and going deep to shape the heart into a place of humility. Then in verse 3 it says, and he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna that you did not know. Now think about that a minute. So it says, in verse 2 it talks about how God led them, and the goal of leading them was a humble heart. And then in verse 3 it says that he fed them. And the way that he fed them was designed to bring humility in the heart. Both of those passages speak of the heart. Both of those passages speak of humility in the heart. But watch what he did. Verse 2, it says the whole way he led them was designed to bring humility in the heart. Then the whole way, it didn't say the whole way, but the way that he fed them, the provision of God, if you would, the way God provides for us is designed to bring humility in our lives. Think about it. How did he lead them? He led them and fed them with the goal of a humble heart. How did he lead them for 40 years in the wilderness? Remember the phrase? It was a cloud by day and a fire by night. They never knew how long the cloud would stay. They never knew how long the fire would go. They didn't know how far it would move from day to day, from night to night. They had no idea what the next day would look like. Maybe they would stay put for 48 hours, maybe for 3 weeks, maybe for one day. They never knew. They lived a nomadic life, and it was all designed, the whole way God led them was divinely designed to bring humility of heart. The whole way he fed them. How did he feed them? Manna and then quail. They couldn't hoard the manna. They couldn't get enough to start a little manna store and sell it. It only lasted one day. Give us this day our daily bread. God provided. They learned to be dependent on God every single day. They learned to trust that God would come through every single day for them. There was no way they could live any other way, and that was designed for what? Not just to fill their stomachs, but to shape their hearts. It was designed to bring humility, we're told, and to teach them in verse 3. It says, to make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And then he goes on in verse 5 and talks about that heart, that how he's shaping the heart. So when God led them and when God fed them, the way he chose to do it was all about the heart and establish humility in the heart. And then he goes, now when you get in the land, the next few verses, when you get into that land, don't forget, remember, and then he repeats it. Verse 14, he talks about, lest your heart be lifted up. That's pride. That's the opposite of humility. And then he says that you remember God, verse 15, here it goes again, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock. So again, like verse 2, verse 15 says, he led you, and then verse 16, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know. Why? That he might humble you. The way he fed, the way he led was designed to bring humility and, verse 16, to test you to do good in the end. Remember that phrase, to do good in the end. And then he goes on and says, beware lest your heart starts taking credit for what God did. This is what he did for them. Now, when I think about how God led me and how God fed me, how God got me, let's say, to the Philippines, and how God provided for me while there, I look back now and I realize he did all that to deal with pride in my life. What God was doing was something that was not just about giving me money to pay the rent or food on my table for my family. It wasn't just about getting me from Mississippi to the Philippines. No, there was something, he could have done that in a lot easier way. He could have just taken care of it like that. But he designed the way he led me and the way he fed and provided for me. He designed it in a way that would break pride in my life, in a way that would produce dependency on him, not on my own resources and my own cleverness and my own relational network and all of these things. And I bet if you look back at the way God led you and the way God's provided for you, that you'll see that he was doing something beyond leading and providing. He was going deep in the heart to fix it, to fix the heart in a way that would bring him honor and him praise and him glory. So remember this. When I think about this text, this chapter 8 begins with this idea how God led and fed to humble. Then it tells how they get there. And then he gives a warning at the end of the chapter. Remember, God led you and fed you to humble you. But then he says this key idea at the very end of verse 16, to do you good in the end. It might not be happy or pleasant or fun while God is leading in a way that brings humility and while God is feeding in a way that brings humility. But remember, no matter what God is doing, no matter what circumstances he is shaping, he's doing it to form humility in your heart, but he's doing it ultimately to do you good in the end. It's going to end up for our better. One day we'll see it. Right now, maybe not. Right now, we're crying out for provision. God, would you feed me? Would you provide? Would you give me this building and that open door and whatever else as leaders we're trusting him for? If you can roll it up a decade and look back, gosh, that was for my own good. Trust him that way. He's a good God who is orchestrating circumstances for your own good.